Hello and welcome to Module 6. We will be splitting this module into 3 lectures. So today is going to be Lecture 8. The Part A, we will be talking about marketing basics and disruptive innovation. That will be about an hour long. And Part B will be about the lead user, and we will talk about branding and personas. It'll be also about an hour long. And Part C, the 3, is about marketing plan and strategy. Also be an hour long. So these will be spread about 3 weeks. And I have here my son, who's he's dropping. Hi. With the basics for today, um, the reason why I called them part D1, D2, and D3 is because of the names of the deliverables you need to submit, right? So project deliverable D1, and D2 and D3 are going to be due for the next 3 weeks consecutively. That's for the week of July 1st and the weeks of for July 1st, July 8th, and July 15th, respectively. So let's project deliverable D1, okay? So we'll start talking about the marketing basics here. First thing, what marketing means to students, especially if you're not haven't taken marketing before, may differ. So let's first talk about what marketing means. Marketing can mean several things. It can include talking about advertisement. It can include talking about forecasting, and can talk about analysis. And so these three are fundamental components when we talk about marketing. If you wanna, I quote one of the guest speakers we've had a couple of years ago, who is an entrepreneur. He said was if you want to put marketing in a small sentence, you want to define it in a quick way, then it is about knowing where your company will be in 6 years and knowing where you will go in 6 months. And so knowing where your company will be in 6 years, that's basically the forecast here. And then knowing where you will go in 6 months, of course, you're going to use the information in analysis from the previous period, and then put a plan that would include promotion in order to reach where you want to reach within 6 months. Okay, so these three aspects are very, very important to marketing. I can't stress how important, because this is basically the pillar of how the business works, right? So if you think about any tech company, if you think about Samsung, for example, it's not the engineers who decide, you know what, it's time for us to release the Galaxy S10 or 20 or 30 or 5,000. It's the marketing division who decides. So marketing division says, looking at the market right now, we need to release 2 flagship phones in 2021, which means that we're going to have to release one in January, and we're going to have to release one, say, like in July or whatever, right? And then they put these requirements down on the engineering team. So they say, you know what, whatever technology you're 100% sure you'll be able to provide by, it's going to mass produce by January. Let's sit and see what we can do, and then we can put the specs for them. And so it's a discussion that starts from a marketing perspective, using forecasting, using analysis, then combines with the engineering team to put a plan of execution and a timeline on deadlines, and eventually see how we can get there. All right. So let's now we talk about marketing analysis. So that part in itself is essential for forecasting and for promotion. And this is going to be the majority of your first assignment. So studying about analysis. There are 4 very easy ways to get into the world of marketing analysis that I'm going to be describing right now. The first one is customer segmentation. The second one is a SWOT analysis. The third one is market and product positioning. And the fourth one is competitive landscape. I'm going to remove my face. There you go, so that we can see the slides better. And I'm going to use my pen to give examples. So when we talk about customer segmentation, let's think of a company that we have taken an example about in earlier course, in an earlier class, which is LinkedIn. So LinkedIn has, we saw the segmentation that was, users or regular users. There were headhunters, and then there were, or recruiting companies, and then there were companies looking for companies looking for a portfolio, and then there were developers, right? Or my apologies, this was advertisement companies, the third one, and the developers, right? No autocorrect when you're typing on a whiteboard. Now, when we say these four, they need to be exhaustive of all the customers of the company, and also they need to have enough contrast between them so that a person is not in two segments at the same time. So let's say if instead of users we had a group, I mean additional to users, we could say it's also students, young professionals, headhunters, etc. So I could have a group, a segment called students by itself. But the problem with that is that I am going, what's the difference between having that student category as a segment of its own and having young professionals? The answer is there isn't much. There isn't much difference. And so general users would include students, would include young professionals. The lesson here is that as long as you can actually merge young professionals, as long as you can actually merge two different groups, that they're effectively the same in terms of your marketing perspective, then there's no need to split them. So I'll get to this in lecture 2 in more details, but this is just basically for you to know a little bit about customer segmentation. It's very important that you're able to segment your customers so that you're able to talk to each group appropriately, right? If you have a group of, let's say, you are a supplier and you can sell things individually and you can sell things in bulk. The way that you talk to somebody who's buying, like a customer who is worth $10, remember when we talked about the customer lifecycle value, the CLV? When we talk about a customer who's worth only $10 is very different than when we talk with a customer whose CLV is $100,000. And so you want to segment your customers in a way that your product differential is there appropriate to each customer segment. That's the first thing. The second thing is to talk about SWOT analysis. And SWOT, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it stands for strength, weaknesses, then, so these are the first two. Okay, so I'm just gonna do it in a more proper SWOT fashion. So it's a quadrant of strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is how SWOT analysis is normally done. And it's basically a quadrant where you put, you're going to do a SWOT analysis of your own company. So you say, okay, what strengths are we bringing into the game? What weaknesses do we have? What opportunities we may be able to gain? And what threats that are facing. Same thing when you are looking at a competitor, you can do a SWOT analysis to a competitor. You can also do a SWOT analysis to the industry. What's strong about the industry or the whole market, and what's weak, and what the opportunities to grow, and what are the threats for the whole market. Okay. Now, the third way of analysis is to do a market and product positioning. We'll talk about this in a little bit. But in short, it is how we can do, we need to understand where we lie on the either one-dimensional line of a uh, uh, certain dimension in the market. For example, the price point, that price positioning, there's going to be cheapest to most expensive. Do we have a vision or a philosophy in our company to be always in a certain relative group on that dimension? Do we want to be among the 10% cheapest or the 10% more most expensive, for example? And what are the things that entail that positioning decision? Same thing in the market positioning. Do you want to be the fastest, the best, the smallest, the biggest, the most diverse? Whatever positioning you do, it has, of course, requirements, and it has consequences. So that's something to talk about in a bit as well. Finally, is we talk about the competitive landscape, and I'm going to bring this in probably the very first thing to talk about, the competitive landscape. One thing that brings all of this together, and I think that's the first thing I'm going to talk about now, is this really powerful um, marketing research agency called IBISWorld, which provides marketing research reports. Each report costs thousands of dollars. Their entire database has tens of thousands, or thousands, if not tens of thousands of reports. And you can actually access them as a student at the University of Ottawa completely for free. And I'm going to show you how we do that. Okay, so this took me a little while to get this fixed. Unfortunately, I can't, all the add-ins to view a web browser inside PowerPoint are malfunctioning. And so what I did, an example, is that I went to IBISWorld. Now, as I mentioned, you have this access through the university library. Since the library is closed right now, you can still access everything online. You just need to have your VPN account on, and I believe any student should be able to do it right now. You don't need to be a TA or anything, or a research assistant. You just call the university if you don't have that login already activated for you. But basically, this is the link that's directly going to take you to IBISWorld. If you want to take the scenic route, you just go to biblio.uottawa or bib.uottawa.ca, and then from there you can go to the databases and then go to the letter I, and then click on IBISWorld. If you're accessing this from off-site, it's going to ask you for your uOttawa username and password to give you access to the VPN. So once you click this, you can open the website. It has thousands of reports, as I've mentioned. I picked, just for a random example, I picked this fast food restaurants in Canada. So I just wrote fast food, and I got a report for fast food restaurants in Canada, fast food restaurants in the US, fast food restaurants in China. And then when you click on it, you'll be able to see, it will show you a SWOT analysis, it will show you the biggest competitors, it will show you the market size, growth opportunities, barriers to entry, so many details that you can use it for your, it's vital. You wouldn't be able to actually enter any market with if you enter any market without being fortified with this amount of information, you're really entering blindly into a market. So you really need this information, and you need to know it really well if you want to become a competitor in that market. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to click on this, but hopefully the slides I'm going to give you, I'm not sure if you will be. You'll be able to click on it. I will attach the fast food restaurants in Canada on Brightspace as a PDF for you to look through and see the example of what you can get out of this IBISWorld. So let's move on and look at an example of market landscape. So this is a marketing landscape, and it's the simplest way of showing a competitive landscape. I'm sure you have seen, 100 different types of a competitive chart online, whether you're comparing different products in the same company or comparing different providers for the same solution. There's so many ways of this demonstrating visualizing that data. And the power of visualization is that it can give you so much information in very little easy to grasp way. So here, this is an example. I'm just going to minimize my picture again. Here's an example of four different companies. Vitaltronics is a company that I had started, founded about 15 years ago, and it was about medical electronics. And this was actually one of the slides I used when I presented my pitch to one of the investors. It was the first $250,000 that I raised as a result in to this very cheesy slide. But I mean, the fact that, being able to present all the data to back it up. So there were three competitors back then. Biggest competitors were AliveCore, Azumio, and Polar. And I decided to use these four specific columns, right? So these are not standardized columns. The columns that you use are basically what are you using as your what did we call it? Like unique selling point. Those were my four unique selling points of my company, that we were feature loaded. We were what is called in the industry as a full turnkey solution, not partial. So AliveCore was basically a case for the iPhone back in 2011 or 12, that emerged, that did ECG testing through the phone. So you basically, let me put the camera here. So basically, you put the phone, you put the case, and then you put the case on your bare chest, and it would, using the app, it would be able to show. Now, without a phone, you wouldn't be able to use it, but it was basically a phone add-on. And you would need the phone for the software, and then you need the subscription, and so on. Azumio was just a simple app that did very simple, didn't do ECG, but it gave you your heart rate using the smartphone camera. So you just take the camera, put it on your fingertip, and run the Azumio app, and it would be able to actually see the changes, yeah, believe it or not, in the color hue, and it would tell you when is it dark and less, and it would be able to detect your heart rhythm during that free app. Polar, of course, was purchased by Nike. It was a massive company, and what they had is that they had a lot of accessories. But these accessories, you buy the accessory, and it's part of another. It's like a they try to buy you all in, similar to how Apple is, but a lot more strict back then. So you had to have the Nike Plus shoes, and you had the Polar wristband, and you had to have the software, and you had to, and all this in order to get some health tracking. And what I was offering is basically a watch device before smartwatches existed, a smartwatch device in which it does your ECG, full medical ECG testing. That's an echocardiogram, the electric, map of your heart, for patients, so that many patients, we studied about 600 patients who were still staying in hospital only because doctors wanted to see their ECG for 3-4 days after a heart surgery, and they could not release them home because they did not have equipment to rent them to go home. So this was a cheap device, less than $200, and doctors can take it, give it to the patients, or patients can buy it on their own, and they'll be able to get, they don't need a phone, they don't need a smartphone, anything else. Anyone can operate it, even a senior person with limited access to technology, and it will store their ECG. It can transmit it over 3G back then signal, or 2G, and if there's any alert, it would inform 911, right? So that was basically the reason why I said it's full feature, right? So you just put a little thing here, but it doesn't mean sometimes when I do these marks, it doesn't go exactly where I'm supposed to do. So right now I see it. I circled the full circle in Vitaltronics features, but somehow, sometimes in the recording, it goes to the left and top. Anyway, the second thing was the whole product. And the third thing, well, the whole product was the fact that you didn't need to attach it to a device or to buy it with a subscription. It came as a one piece standalone. The fact that it had a, much, with testing with patients that they were complaining a lot about the user interface, the user experience with the other, and we got a lot of customer interviews during our customer discovery phases that favored the design of our device over what they saw on the other devices and software. Finally, the localization. And I was selling this device for an investor in the Middle East, and so none of these devices had. Some of them had several languages, but none of them were available in Arabic, and I had made it available in English and Arabic. So being able to infiltrate the Middle East market with a device that could be used in Arabic language with seniors who don't speak English was a big advantage to that market. So that's basically how you draw a competitive landscape. Now, if I were, as you can see, I just spent about 7 minutes trying to explain just one row of why Vialtronics is better. But when you look at this slide and you see, then you'd be able to quickly, it's like, okay, this is one, this is two, this is three, this is four. These are the four most important unique value propositions that Vitaltronics is, or unique selling points that Vitaltronics is bringing to the market. And these are what Vitaltronics believes to be the strongest three competitors, right? So this is how you basically can portray a competitive landscape. The very specific method I'm using with the pie chart is actually called a moon chart, even though it doesn't look like a moon, it does like a pie. But I guess essentially back in the day before PowerPoint, it used to be like moon phases. So you get it a little bit up until like a half moon to a full crescent. I mean, to a full moon from a small crescent, depending on how much you are fulfilling that service, right? Or fulfilling that column. But nowadays you have the power of emojis, the power of symbols. You can do dollar signs for a price to see. Oh, that's an important one. Make sure that you actually standardize. When it comes to dollar sign, I've seen many people fall into that, and they put $5 signs because they want to show that they're the cheapest. And of course, now that you know the standard. If you look at the restaurant review and it says it's $4 signs out of five, it means it's more expensive. So if you want to put something on the dollar sign, it's going to be the less the better. Or you flip it and you say, instead of price, you say affordability, and then you can put like 5 stars on affordability. And now that more stars is cheaper. That's just a side grant when I'm talking about pricing. But basically, you pick the three, four, or five most important features. If it's a really condensed market, like smartphone market, you've seen how smartphones features compare. You'd be like 30, 40, 50 different. It wouldn't actually be columns, it would become rows because it's so long. And you want to see the RAM, you want to see the disk drive, you want to see the camera, you want to see the back camera, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the seventh camera. You want to see all these other features and compare one to one because it's such a condensed space. The comparison is a lot more competitive. So you'd have to have more features. Of course, if it's you would decide depending on what you have, how many features you need to show, and whether you need to put your companies in the rows or the columns. If you want to increase more rows to have more features, that is all dependent on the market of your choice. Also, how many competitors are around you. But that's basically minimum you would do is, of course, three different competitors. So you and two others, that's the minimum. The standard is four. Sometimes a few times I've seen five, but it becomes useless. You're doing a systematic map at that point if you're doing five or six or seven competitors. You need to focus on what is it that you're bringing it to the market that would defeat the closest and most popular competitors. So that's kind of a shared circle between what's the closest competitor. So my closest competitor was actually a Zoomio, even though they did not do an ECG. But nobody knew about Zoomio. It was a startup in Japan, and I was a startup in Canada, and so it was, um, you know, popularity wise, nobody would know. But Polar, it was purchased by Nike, and it was a seven-figure company, and AliveCore was a US company. And so I could have picked a dozen other apps on Android or Apple that had some similarity, but I wanted to pick three competitors that really span over a good verticals. So LiveCore, well, it was iOS, but also it was US based. Azumio was a free app, and Polar was a device by Nike. So I picked three, distinct competitors to show who they are. So make sure you don't fall into making all your competitors are the same dimension. So you like compete against three other Android apps and that's it. And you don't show that there's a website that's much better than all of you together, or that there's a device or whatever is not, right? So that's the story about competitive landscape. It's very powerful. It's very, very important. And most important thing I've probably mentioned is that doesn't matter how beautiful it looks, you need to stand by your data. That you can't, that you beware of providing some numbers or some figures that do your own rating in the real world, of course. Yeah, for an assignment, I may forgive this, but you can't come to an investor and say, oh, I'm scoring Nike or Air Jordans 3 out of 4, and my shoes are going to be 4 out of 4, and they're going to be based on what? And I'm like, well, I don't like them personally. You can't do that. You'll be destroyed. Your credibility will be destroyed. You have to have independent, your customer discovery, what you're doing right now. It's amazing, amazing resource, independent, verifiable. They said that you showed them the Air Jordans, you showed them your pair of shoes, and they said we pick your pair of shoes because it's got, I don't know, it cooks or whatever it is. That's that eventually you need to provide some credible backing or proof for why you've rated each of these pies or moons on your chart the way you did. So I hope that explains competitive landscape. All right. So here we are at market disruption. We're starting a new topic here, and this is the most important topic in this lecture. So this is going to take us about another 20 minutes or so. Market disruption is basically when we are bringing something new, but we want to change the rules of the game. We're not coming in as another food truck in town, or as another restaurant, or as another shoe company, or as another medical device, but we are the medical device. We are the company that is going to come and is going to make everyone else change the way they play, right? Just 2 days ago, what's his name? Hamad Faqih is a Canadian Lebanese entrepreneur in Toronto, opened a new restaurant. The restaurant is called Boxed, and that restaurant basically is the first restaurant in Canada that is 100% contactless ordering restaurant. So you walk in, it's only screens and lockers, what appears to be like futuristic lockers. You either order from your phone or from a touchscreen the menu you want. There are chefs in the back. Once your order is ready, one of the screens are gonna pop up, brighten, say, order number 34 here. You unlock it with whatever measure you have, with a code or something, and then it opens, and then you find your order there, you pick it up and you go. The idea is that if there's enough lockers that if people are in downtown Toronto, you're at work, you order your thing, and it's going to be at a locker waiting for you. the lockers are heated, those little windows, enclosed and heated. And so, the entire time you're walking in and walking out of the restaurant is about 10 seconds. You walk in, you finish your order, you walk in, your order is ready, you click on that, you get it, and you leave. And so you don't need to line up, you don't need to see a cashier, you don't need to pay a cashier. It's significantly changing it would significantly change the margins, the profit the restaurant owner would be able to make, number of the orders that they can fulfill per hour, and the overall experience, right? Let alone, even in the interview I just watched yesterday, he was talking to CBC, I believe, and uh, and he was saying this was actually pre-COVID-19. This was something we've been planning for a couple of years, and COVID-19 provided the extra little metric that people need some physical distancing and stuff. But the idea wasn't that. The idea was traffic management. That you walk into a restaurant, pick up your food, and get out within 10 seconds without having to stand in line and finding your food ready when you order it. Because even when you order food for pickup, it's like 2 minutes for you walk in, wait for the line, get to your order, say what's your number, verify, and they go and look for it, and they have to bring it sometimes and compile it in front of you at that moment. So that was the point, right? And now that this company is in, you might see if depending on how it goes well, more companies are going to start to look. More restaurants are like, you know what? We can let go our cashier. We can become touchless restaurant. And so this is a kind of disruption. When we talk about disruption, is basically a new player coming in, and that product would have some features, certain features, that would make everyone in the market look at them like, oh, I'm going to have to change the way I present. Now, there are two ways for disruption. Disruption happens, well, in a good way and a bad way, but both are ways that change the relatively, not both of them can be good. But both of them change the market significantly. The first one is called a low-end disruption, and the second one is called a new market disruption. Now, before I get to talk about these two red lines, I need to explain to you that the blue line, which stands for sustaining innovation, that's the status quo, right? Every company releases, the iPhone 1, the iPhone 3, the iPhone 5, iPhone 10, iPhone 11, iPhone 12, right? That's a sustaining innovation. That's a gradual, step by step, non-revolutionary, sensical advancement in the technology. So that's not disruption, right? Bringing LTE is not disruption. Bringing 5G is not disruption. It's just the next step that makes sense, right? If 5G is going to be so fast that it's going to introduce all these new security threats, oh, you know that 6G is going to be even faster, right? And have even greater risks and security measures that need to be involved. It's just the sustaining innovation. So what we want to look, a disruptive in the cell phone industry is what, for example, Elon Musk is trying to do by introducing satellite phones, right? So you have unlimited text and unlimited data around the world for $30 a month, wherever you are. One cell company for the whole northern hemisphere, run by low orbit satellites, and that's it, right? So that's his vision of disrupting all of cell phone companies, destroying towers, no more, losing a spot in a forest, etc., that kind of thing. So this is a kind of a disruption. Now let's move on and talk about what is low-end disruption. Okay, this is from the book and here we go. So it can show you the differences in terms of sustaining innovation, low-end disruption, and new market disruptions, and you'll be able to compare, what is each one with regards to the customer, with regards to the performance and the business model. Now let's talk about low-end disruption. I'm giving two examples here. I'm going to start with the example on the right. This is the example of the steel industry. the steel industry is a enormous industry that has really strong lobby in the United States. It's an industry that has brought people to become presidents, and it's an industry that has removed presidents from their position and brought opponents to win based on their interests. It's one of course, the biggest industries in the U.S. in the 20th century. So in the around the 70s, this new invention that started to emerge that was called the mini mills. And before I talk about the mini mills, I need to explain that steel manufacturing is a very, very expensive and wasteful process that involves tens of thousands of square footage per factory, so much pollution, and so much process that needs to happen in order. You need to be really, really wealthy in order to enter into that market. So the barrier to entry was very, very high, and the expenses are very high. You need to have the entire network with the supplier, with everything, and the manufacturing was really, really expensive. But the problem with it here is that the expense. Well, it's not a problem. Well, we're going to see how it becomes a problem. The quality of the steel manufacturing industry in the US was very, very, very good. And you ask me, how can that be a problem? And I can explain to you right now why that exactly explains what low-end disruption is. The quality was, in short, too good for most uses, right? It was an overkill in a lot of the uses of the steel. And so this mini mill idea came up. Mini mill is basically a little call it a portable factory. It's a portable factory that can, like, the diameter of the mill is it's like a cylinder um, that has a diameter of about 10 meters or 30 feet, right? With like a few meters high. And think of it as like you're making a single pot meal. If you cook at home by yourself, you know how important and valuable are the single pot meals. You just need to put everything, throw it in one meal, like biryani, for example. So you just put everything in one pot and then you cook it and you're done. It's very simple, less mess, less pollution. When you have, less factories and less chambers to operate, it means a lot less energy to burn, and so on. And so they invented this mini mill, and the mini mill basically is kind of akin to the oil production part. So you get different grades of steel, from top being the best to bottom being the worst, just like in the oil purification industry. So the highest form of oil when you're working in the refinery is basically what, like, white gasoline that's used for airplanes, all the way down to tar, which is used for asphalt and stuff. So different products come depending on the quality. So that's basically what the mini mill was. We're gonna produce steel at different qualities. Most importantly, we're gonna produce steel at lower than standard quality, lower than the U.S. steel industry standard, and sell it for much cheaper for things that don't require a lot of requirements. So let me take my face again and look. Let's look at this. The lowest grade steel in terms of requirement was the rebar. The rebar is basically, I don't know, I lived in the Middle East for a while, and so pictures of war was very common. And so you see concrete that's broken with little sticks of iron rods that are usually rusty, sticking out of concrete. Now, to civil engineers, that's kind of a silly way of portraying it. But the point I actually bring this example always is that nobody ever sees rebars after they're molded, after you put them in the concrete. They're put there for the rest of their life, right? Like, unless the building is bombed, you would never see rebars. So they have absolutely no point in being aesthetically pleasing. Their entire purpose is that the steel inside the concrete makes it into something called reinforced concrete, and that is a lot sturdier than concrete without steel inside it. And it's just a couple of rebars, you add it to the concrete and makes it so much more powerful. So what we're looking at is We need the chemical structure of the steel to be there. We don't need much of other than that. We don't need it to be shiny. We don't need it to be really good quality. We just need it to be steel. And so they started producing at the mini mills. They started producing these rebars, and they're very, very low cost compared to the steel industry, the mainstream steel industry. Now, what was the reaction of the mainstream steel industry? They were like, you know what? Rebar is just 4% of the total market. Let them have them, right? And that arrogance to small players, it was usually kills the big players and changes markets. You've seen it with Blockbuster, you've seen it with taxi lobbies, with Uber and Blockbuster and Netflix, and so on. So they said, you know what? It's low quality steel anyway. Let them have it. Of course, within, as you can see in the graph, from the beginning of the 70s up until the end of the 70s, the minimals were able to drive the entire mainstream steel industry outside the rebar market. So they controlled 100% of it. Because, you know, why would you buy the ton of rebar for like $100 when you can buy it for $60, right? It doesn't make any sense. It gives you everything. So contractors, which always cared for the most efficient building contractors, immediately went for the minimals, and just a couple of years, the whole steel industry stopped producing rebars. By that time, you know, while they're getting more sales, they're using the money to improve their production, they improve their technology. And so by the 80s, they were able to enter into the angle iron. So angle iron, you know, those sometimes are, you know, in the site building, you find a lot of angle irons. So sometimes they're more visible in the building, and they're a lot bigger. So they have a bit more demands in terms of quality. But by now, the mini mill industry can actually produce good enough steel that can sell to angle irons, again, at a fraction of the cost of what the steel industry is doing. And lo and behold, less than a decade, they would drive away the entire steel industry, the mainstream factories, from manufacturing angle iron, and they produce it 100%. And then you look at, you know, as the quality of the milli mill produced steel is increasing, they start to take over more and more products from the steel industry until, you know, the 90s, where basically the old school factories no longer could produce anything that was comparable, neither in quality nor in price, to the mini mills. Mini mills were producing even the highest quality of steel, which is sheet steel and steel that can be used in like food and things that are very you know, high quality standards. And mini mills were able to produce that, and still yet much smaller cost, carbon footprint, environmental footprint, smaller physical footprint on, you know, spaces. And so the entire industry basically eventually surrendered and bought in, and everyone who had the factory had to switch their equipment to these mini mills and bring their technologies in. So that's basically what a low-end disruption would do. Take the example on the left. I'm not going to talk much about it because you see it, but just keep in mind that 50 years ago, there could be hardly any single non-US manufactured car in the US, right? So the automobile industry in the US was almost exclusively controlled by US manufacturers, and they put the rules of the game. So the US cars in the 60s and the 70s, they were, you know, up until then, you look at the ads, it's about horsepower, it's about drag, it's about you know, how big this car is, how muscular it is, how loud its engines. All the cars were advertised in that sense. So people would look at them and you know, they're gas guzzlers and these massive Chevys and all these different cars. And this is how people looked at them. Now, Japanese cars and you know, Korean cars and Asian cars, where population density was a lot higher in East Asia, and they had different goals. The goals were about versatility and utility and actually small size, cost efficiency and small size. Because in cities in Beijing, or cities in Tokyo, or massive crowded cities, it was about it wasn't important how big your car is. It was really important where to find a parking spot. And so they started bringing these cars to the US, and it was a big shock, right? It was a big shock. Like these massive cars made of reinforced steel, right? You close the door of one of these GMC Suburbans, and you feel like you've just entered into a tank. Uh, and then you compare it to like a Toyota RAV4, and you feel like you're sitting in a sheet of aluminum, uh, like aluminum foil even. It's so much lighter as a car. So people mocked it, and then they said, "Oh, it's so much lighter. Oh, it doesn't have the same horsepower as our cars, etc." But as a couple of years with advertisement and right marketing, people started to realize it's not really important for me to have a car that weighs 2 tons if am unable to park it downtown. So I need a smaller car. I need a car that's more cost efficient. After you can see there's a jump in 1979. There was a war, well, a couple of wars in the Middle East that started, but the first major like uh, uh, oil crisis that happened in between 1976 and 1978 with the formation of OPEC. That kind of before that point, if you can see the little here, you can see this little. Oops, I'm sorry. Um, I clicked by mistake and we lost that. So the point was, price of oil started to get more expensive, and then people started to see value in the Asian cars, and by 20 years later, you find that the U.S. industry, U.S. automobile industry itself, have changed to adopt the standards of success, the unique selling points that the Asian cars. So now you look at Ford and you look at other companies, and it tells you how fuel efficient it is and how versatile and all these different features, interior features and technology and stuff that were not very common or even looked at in U.S. Car makers before, but now they actually started to compete with Asian car makers because people at the end of the day, if the cheapest car was $30,000, and then Asian cars are coming into the market with like starting from like $12,000, people are gonna look for cheaper cars if they have very basic needs. And so with more and more going to cheaper and less fancy options and less strength to something that's more basic, you can fulfill many more households and students and small users like that. Okay, so we move to this slide, um, which I had already moved into it by mistake by tapping. Here we go. I didn't click the coloring. Sorry. So one thing that is what this slide is aims to talk about is the dangers of or the setbacks of low-end disruption. Now, low-end disruption has its merits when there is an appetite for less quality. Well, appetite for less quality is kind of an oxymoron, but when there is room for people to say, I don't need all that, I need to go lower. Okay, and it stays there. So once you build it there, it's not a good idea to take that low-end product and try to take it up again. People are just gonna not respect it or accept it in a way. So I'm gonna give you these two stories. The first story is about involving this car. I'm gonna give you 5 seconds. Well, it's been 2 minutes now already. I'm not sure if you've guessed it. It's not a Passat. It's a car called the Phaeton, right? Volkswagen Phaeton. This car was kind of the dream legacy car of the CEO of Volkswagen just before retiring. he wanted a legacy car, a car that could, last, its name can last forever and be his biggest legacy that he left with Volkswagen. So he sat before retiring, he sat with a team of marketing, and then he sat with a team of engineers. Rumors in the internet rumors about this story say that about 30% of the senior engineering staff in Volkswagen submitted their resignations upon that meeting, like upon seeing the product specs that he was expecting them to build of this car. So he wanted basically a car that was faster than a Porsche, that was more luxurious from inside than a Maybach, that was more better crafted than Rolls-Royce. It competed with every car on the planet on every high-end uh, product or spec in every kind of way. It was more luxury than or elegant than an S-Class Mercedes, and it was more like uh, uh, casual smart than a BMW 6 Series and whatnot, and an Audi and all these kind of things. But eventually they pulled it off. They pulled it off, and they presented this car after a couple of years, and it went into mass manufacturing. It was a brilliant car, seriously unheard of. The quality is unheard of. The engine is unheard of. The amount of features is unheard of. It kind of shattered every. It's like a bucket list for a car manufacturer. Literally, he was retiring. He's like, I want to take all of this with me, and it was retailing, so like a decent S class with full options. It was like around $120,000 US, and this one was retailing at like maybe like 90,000 US. Okay, it was significantly cheaper than the Mercedes S class, but yet it had so much like overpowered. It was faster, better, fancier. The leather seats, the entertainment, the fridge, the whatever, like so fancy from the inside. And of course, it was a massive failure. And if you want to ask, there was a very, very simple question why it failed so miserably. The answer is actually right about here, that it had the Volkswagen logo. It's like anyone in their right mind who has an extra $100,000 laying on their nightstand, if they were going to buy a car, they're not going to buy a car that has a Volkswagen logo around, right? It was kind of an oxymoron to see a fancy Volkswagen. The entire philosophy of Volkswagen, when it was built in Germany, it was like the Tim Hortons of cars. It was like the average Joe, decent German car that was affordable to everyone. So to take that, after 50 years of building that brand, that we're going to do it at a lower level, and then go and say I'm going to make an expensive lower level car, is kind of really defeats its purpose. This wasn't a single mistake. This is actually a very repetitive mistake in low end disruption. I'm only going to pick two bad examples and one good example from the automobile industry, but you find it all over. Every low end disruptor has, market. It's very common for a low end disruptor to fall into, we want to provide a luxury low end disruption brand, right? So let's look at another example here, and this example is right here. You can tell that it is the Kia. And this is called the Kia K900, right? Look it up. Look up the Morpheus advertisement from the Matrix. They have commercials for the K900 commercials. There's like 5 or 6. You're gonna crack up. They're so funny. They're just so overkill and like full of cheese. Um, but they did exactly what Volkswagen was trying to do. They did an incredible car. It's the first car in the history of like automobile, commercial cars to design its seats from in the same system that first class airplane seats would be designed. So all 4 seats were coach, like captain chairs, I mean. all four seats had like 10-way power, lumbar support, and like massage and heat and cold air, and um, just the fact that the rear seat could actually go back and move individually, and had air, and had like even sound system that could blast the bass or subwoofer from underneath the seat so you can feel the music, and had like all these really, really, really expensive add-ons. Had the first car to ever release the 360 bird eye view and the parking assist system and all these different features. And it again, it was so fancy that Kia decided to actually branch off and make Kia VIP dealerships. So these were dealerships that you go, and they had Cadenza, I think it was called. There was another car that they made that was also a luxury car. Later on, they made the Stinger as well. And so you find it at Kia VIP dealerships, and the dealerships were completely imagined. Like worldwide, they had to change the decor and make these dealerships look fancier and train the staff. And so they're selling cars that are more expensive Kias, and of course, as you can tell, it also failed miserably in their forecasts in profits, because this one was in Canada, was selling for $115,000 Canadian, or $90,000 US. And so who in their right mind would drive a Kia for over 100,000 Canadian dollars was the question. And the answer was nobody in their right mind. Now, just to look at, okay, is that even a possibility to do that at all? The answer is yes. You can still do it and succeed with it if you do it in the right way. And take a look at this example right here. For those of you who already know what I'm talking about, this is the, oops, why? My pen stopped working. Here we go. Okay, so this is the Lexus. Lexus was basically the decision when Toyota entered the US market, and they got, they did the disruption. They entered from the low end disruption, and they got a really good base of a customer base. They wanted to go to a luxury product line, and they said, wait, everyone knows this here in the US as the cheap car. So if we bring a luxury, it's going to defeat the idea of a luxury, and therefore we need to create a new brand and separate it in marketing and advertisement than our brand, and make that specific to luxury brands. And so Lexus was born. Lexus is a Toyota company. It's manufactured in Toyota factories. It's got all the Toyota spare parts plus $100. Like literally, if you go and look at, for example, the radiator of Toyota, and like of a Camry, and this is a, I don't know, like an RX 430 or something, then it would be exactly the same radiator, except like the nuts and bolts, they have changed the order so that you can't go and cheap and buy the Toyota one and install it on the on the Lexus one. That little like the same product part would be like, let's say $100 for Toyota, it would be like 250 for Lexus. It's exactly the same. It's just like been designed to not fit the same one. You have to put like different bolts here and different screws there. And that's basically how they play the game of course, Lexus is a very successful, one of the most successful luxury brands in the US, because it's an affordable luxury brand. That's what Kia and Volkswagen were trying to do. The biggest failure they had is that they did not, they forgot to remove their own branding. They should have created a new brand with it. And in fact, you find a lot of jeans companies and cheap shirts, and you'll be surprised, like Gap and H&M and these really affordable, fast fashion companies. They own luxury brands, which is kind of ridiculous. Like H&M is where I buy sometimes for my kids, like a shirt for $10, right? So for you to think that this is a kind of a company where you'd find luxury, it doesn't make sense. And they actually thought that, well, the same thing for like Levi's and these denim brands, jeans brands. They actually also own very luxury high-end suits brands, but they definitely changed the name. So you find a really fancy brand name for suits or clothes owned by a much bigger company, but they make sure that you don't know the relation because it will affect your perspective. So that's the lesson here when you talk about low end disruption is stay in your lane. That positioning you build is a positioning it's kind of a covenant that you keep with your customers and you have to keep. So you can't tell them I'm the cheapest car and then come and try to outsell them something expensive. Same way, you can't come like as an Apple product and say I'm the most you know fanciest product line or among the top 20% of computer lines, and then give a quality of a product that's so cheap, right? You have to kind of fulfill what your marketing and pricing positioning is through your product user experience. So that's the lesson for low end disruption. Now, the second type of the disruption is called new market disruption. And it looks like I missed a word here. So here you go. So new market disruption is unlike the regular low end, the first low end disruption that we talked, it doesn't talk about bringing something low. It doesn't talk about bringing something that's more expensive either, right? Don't make the common mistake of saying it's low end versus high end. A new market is about changing the rules of the game by changing the platform, the technology, the methodology of delivery. The value proposition itself, I'm going to change how it's delivered, right? So the simplest example would be think of how Netflix killed Blockbuster by switching to video on demand or switching to DVDs to start. There were DVDs where Blockbusters continued to do VHS. Before that, think of how Sony introduced a Walkman. I'm not sure if you guys were alive back then, but born yet. But the Walkman was a revolutionary thing I had in my teens, and it was you no longer carried a cassette player, but rather a CD player, and the fact that you could store hundreds of um, uh, songs or whatever with you on the go instead of just one cassette. And the fact that you can skip, from one track to the second track to the third instead of having to rewind and wait for a minute and then forward and then rewind again, all these kind of things. So that was a disruption in changing the technology. Similar here, I can show you on the right, it's talking about how Sony, our RCA, is a big company that was actually developing the a lot of electronics that used vacuum tubes. It was one of the earliest companies that manufactured TVs and everything like that. And then how Sony came and created this a new market. So did the disruption by saying you're not going to use the vacuum tubes. We're going to use a transistor, right? And we're talking the 60s, 70s. So we're going to use a complete different way of technology. We're going to use digital electronics instead of analog electronics in order to manufacture our equipment. And even though this was a really expensive technology to manufacture and very, very rare, they took the risk. Sony took the risk. And RCA were like, oh, it's too expensive to invest in this new technology. It's too early for us. But by the time this technology became accessible, guess who had the experience and was into the market and was commercial ready? Of course, Sony, right? They were the first to climb the mountain when it was the most difficult to climb. But at the time of sliding down, they were very, very prepared. And so that they took RCA off from being the world leader in consumer electronics, just like that. Like with the introduction of TVs, with the introduction of the pocket radios, portable TVs, and the large TVs, every step of the way, they were able to actually take it much faster because they took a new route. We took here on the left is a very common uh, surgical operation that is done in like thousands of times. One of the most common surgeries that's done in the U.S. Is was actually bypass surgery in the 80s, 90s, and even here now in the 2000s. But that's basically it's a simple heart surgery. You have one little clog in one little artery in the heart, and you go and you take a small artery from the foot of the patient or from somewhere else, and you bring it and you make a detour around the clot, and you let the heart continue to operate. So that was basically how the bypass surgery, and they mastered it so well that it became so easy and all of that. But then from the 80s, some doctors, researchers, they were able to come up with this new proposal called the balloon angioplasty, and it was basically literally bringing with a very small tube inside the artery where the clog is, bringing a small balloon and then pumping it. And so that balloon would pump, 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 and then it would push the clot away, and then clear the path, the same path of the artery that was clogged, right? So people are like, oh, it's too expensive, risky, it's too small for us to deal with. How are we gonna be that accurate and etc. But as years come by and medical technology and introduction of so many new technologies with being able to have cameras that zoom in so many times down inside the surgery, like right at where the surgery is, and so many other technologies, this became so much simpler. And so around the mid 90s, there was that major shift. Also because some of famous people, famous actors and politicians doing the balloon angioplasty, and that became like kind of featured. And look at the jump that happened, the impact of those influencers, and people started to use the angioplasty instead of bypass surgeries, and as more people started to use them, they became cheaper and they became more safer, and they became more available to people across the US. So same idea is that you're introducing a new product using a technology that's still state of the art, and then you put your investment in it. Um, it's you're kind of trying to disrupt the market, or make a disruption for the market towards adopting this new technology. Sooner or later, people are going to choose this new technology, and then they're going to have to ditch these old technologies. That doesn't always go the good way, because our investments in technology is no longer linear. For example, you hardly heard about 4G, right? Like 4G was just from 3G to 4G. There was like a several 4G plans. The one that ended up being a 4G didn't do so well, and so the jump to LTE is a parallel technology to 4G basically, and that was much better. So people who invested so much into building the 4G non-LTE one did not do really good on betting that technology would work. I'll give you some more famous standard example. Um, oh, I forgot. Sorry, my memory is running out. But there are many examples where the world was, or the technology frontier was basically going towards either this or that, um, and then it just didn't work out for one of them, even though big companies bet on it. I remember from my childhood, I mean, or youth, I remember there was zip disks before CD drives, where before compact discs, there was a zip disk, which was a floppy that could take 100 MB instead of the 1 MB, and then But it failed against of course, the CD drive that brought 700 megabytes when it first introduced storage. There was the Betamax. That was a really famous. That's the one that I was trying to remember. The Betamax was technology by Sony to try to replace the VHS old videotapes. And so it was smaller tapes that could record better, more hours and last for a lot longer. Their lifetime can be played many times. And then that was killed by Verbatim's, DVD, basically technology and others who developed the DVD. So it was either to go for Betamax or to go for DVD and then Blu-ray. Same thing for Blu-ray. There were actually a couple of competitors. Point is, with new market disruption, because you're shifting from one dimension of XY of this technology to this technology or this technology, there are unlimited number of expansions. You can go right or you can go left. Not like the low market disruption, where all what you're doing is actually you're just providing cheaper service for less products than what people need, right? So that's basically the main difference between the two. And I can show you in the next slide an example of how these become together, and it's called the hybrid disruption. Hello. So here we are. We have the hybrid disruption, and I'm going to give you two examples. The first is Southwest. I'm not sure any of you have flown to the US using or in the US using Southwest. It's an internal domestic flights in the US that's a very affordable flights. We had a couple of airlines. Well, Swoosh is a new Canadian airlines that does only domestic flights that are very cheap, right? Abbotsford, BC to Hamilton, Ontario for like starting from $35 one way, right? Whereas I fly with Air Canada to my family is also I have family in British Columbia, and it's like $1,000 for an Air Canada ticket. But Southwest, what they did, I'm going to explain why it's not just a low-end disruption, and also a note on how low-end disruption can be dangerous. So Southwest was coming in a time in the US where flying was still a luxury, and their mission was to say that we want to make flying planes a good competitor for buses, for cross-country bus rides. So they're actually, when they were planning the Southwest company, the advertisement, the marketing, their main competitor was Greyhound, right? So it was bus companies that traveled across the Canada, across the U.S. And they said, how can you compete with that? Well, they kind of looked at the cost of what would it take somebody to take a bus from, or even road trip from New York to San Francisco, for example, and then they made their price positioning around there. They said, we want to advertise to people. It's going to take you $150 to take buses from New York to San Francisco. Well, we're going to introduce flights from New York to San Francisco for $110, right? And I actually flew Southwest. The first time I flew them was like in 2003, and I flew it from Washington State to New York, return for $110, and it was unbelievable. Like, it was at the same time I flew from Vancouver to Frankfurt in the same year for $1,600, right? So like it's just almost twice the distance for 16 times the price. And that's how cheap they managed to do. But the reason why they were hybrid is because they were not competing with the airlines. They were no way catching up to the standard. So you couldn't get a seat. You couldn't actually get a seat number if you wanted. There were no seat numbers. Anyone gets in. You're lucky if you sit next to a family member. and you couldn't bring luggage. You have to pay extra for luggage, and there was no food for free. You know, back then all food was for free, and you couldn't carry on or do luggage for free, and you couldn't do this and that, and everything was like way so cheap. But they were competing with buses, where they were competing with road trips, people who traveled. Well, not road trips, but you know, people who traveled for moving or whatever cross country for long distances. And you'd find this in their marketing is that they would actually have these billboards in the like Midwest or these states where people usually just fly over and never drive through, and they would have billboards for anyone who's busing through there or driving through there and says like, don't you wish you were up there, like pointing to the the planes above. And it was like Southwest, and like you could have saved, you know, instead of these 6 day trip, you could have actually flown for like in 6 hours and saved so much time and money in the hotels and everything. Well, yeah, yeah, that's what made them a hybrid disruption, is that they brought people who were originally, let me write that down, they were originally non-consumers to the airlines industry. So these were who? These were bus goers. These were people who drove by cars. And because they provided something so cheap, they were able to bring this new market segment of people who were initially not even a customer. So original airlines, somebody goes to an airline, say, I would like to book it. Do you have anything for $100? And they're like, they would just say, go take the bus, right? They would not consider them to be investment worthy. But Southwest comes and says, this is where our positioning. We're going to be cheaper than every other airlines, and we're going to compete with bus companies. So we're going to bring people to the air with buses, right? And that's what made them a hybrid disruption. Now, the dangerous part is that some people who flew were like, you know what? I'm not, I don't want to pay $800 to fly with whatever, you know, Delta or American. I'm okay to pay $100 with Southwest, and I'm okay with paying getting really bad service or low quality service, and that was a dangerous move because other airlines started to compete to the bottom, right? So for the first time ever, like it was less than 10 years ago, when it's the first time ever that companies like Delta and American Airlines, United, and Air Canada, which were known to be prestigious airlines, started offering these like ticket, what do they call them, tiers that had no free check-in luggage. And now it's actually a standard. You rarely get free check-in luggage in any domestic in Air Canada, you know, 10, 15 years later. It's all because of the dangerous competition to who can offer a cheaper service by removing a lot of the features. And that, if you don't have consumer protection or some agency on behalf of consumers that would monitor the market, that would become a very dirty play. If imagine if people started low-end disrupting bread. They're like, we're going to give you bread that's cheaper. Why would you need all this nutrition? We're going to give you half the nutrition for half the price. Or imagine if people say, and this is true with medical black market, like, why do you need to pay so much for surgery when you can do this minor operation from somebody who's not certified in a little sketchy clinic, and pay a lot less, right? And you have all these medical resorts in the Bahamas and in you know, several countries in Mexico and others, even in the within the US, where they have these really sketchy clinics that people go and like, oh, healing, energy healing for cancer and this and that. And it's basically a low end, they're trying to low end disrupt an essential service, right? Like a medical treatment. Or imagine if somebody comes with education. low-end disruption and says, hey, why do you pay $10,000 to uOttawa where you can just learn for $1,000 on LinkedIn or $100 on LinkedIn learning or Coursera or something, right? And start to offer things that are significantly less in quality because people are not finding a value in that quality. Well, if there is no way from an agency that would stop and say, no, it is essential that we have all doctors are qualified and all educators to be qualified, and there has to be like a threshold below which these services doesn't go to. If we don't have that, then capitalism will kind of dwindle down to find the lowest amount of service they can get for to get profit. The last example here I have, I'm just going to remove my face. Last example here is a company called Charles Schwab, and that was, now we have even a newer company called Wealthsimple, actually a Canadian company that was also a disruptor. Remind note to self, I'm going to replace this example with Wealthsimple. Charles Schwab has already been there for 15 years. But both have done the same thing. So Charles Schwab has basically disrupted the financial industry. Before them, you had to be, let's say you had to be at least a middle class person to be able to invest in the stock market. And Charles Schwab said, why do we only have to bring people who had like an excess disposable income of, let's say, over, let's say, $30,000, where we can actually get 30,000 investors with $1, right? It's much easier to be able to get these much smaller investors. And so what they did is that they introduced this basically a proxy company that would, let's say we have Pepsi here, right? Or Coke, right? So this is Pepsi, and they have PepsiCo has a share of, let's say $100, right? Now you wouldn't buy a single share. It's not, if you're going to invest in Pepsi, you're going to invest in, let's say, 100 shares. So that's a $10,000 investment, because like a single share just sounds not very significant. However, what they did is that they would buy, let's say they would buy a share right here, and then they would split this share to 1,000 micro shares. Yeah, 1,000, you heard that right, right? And now you buy 25 micro shares. Of course, they would have it distributed in a way that you can buy, you can go to their website, start their service, and then say, I want to buy $1 from worth of investment from Apple, $1 from Starbucks, $1 from Coca-Cola, and have a portfolio worth $10 from the 10 biggest companies in the world, right? It's ridiculous because you're buying like, fractions of a share and managed through a middle company. But it also boomed the economy, because imagine, had like millions of students and tens of millions of low-class families who were not considering even to enter into the investment, where it actually now a new target market. So again, same word, they brought non-consumers to the investment market. So they went to students, they went to young professionals, and to low-income families, and said, "Hey, why don't you start? If you can't start an investment account with $1,000 a month, why don't you start an investment account with $10 a month? If you start something that's $10 a week, within like 10 years, you can have like $30,000 in the bank." And so they start to put these ideas into micro investments into a smaller segment, a lower class segment. And that's why they're a hybrid. They're not low end because they're not reaching out to the same customers. They're hybrid because they are basically a new market disruption to the students. Students used to do what with their money? If they had any money, they would put it in the bank in saving accounts, right? So these are people who are competing with saving accounts of banks and GICs, by offering mutual funds at a very, very low and no barrier entry, lower barrier to entry to students, to lower income families, and bring them into that. That's why they were a new market um, disruption from that perspective. And from the perspective of low end, they were in the financial, bringing something lower than anyone else in the financial. So the reason why these two are hybrid is because both of them brought in non-consumers to the field, meanwhile offering service that's much lower than the standard of their respective industries. Okay, so I hope that explains what hybrid disruptors are and how are they different from both. Well, how they combine low end and new market disruption. Thank you. So the last thing I just want to make sure it's clear is to differentiate a disruptive business or product from a non-disruptive business or product. This is called the disruption litmus test. You need to answer three questions. The first two are qualifiers, but the third is the most important. So the first question is there a large population of people who are alienated by the existing competitor landscape? And this is what we were saying about the non-consumers in the fact that there are people who do not, who are disengaged from the current entire market. All the competitors kind of agree together to either do price fixing or keep something too expensive, or not offer too many services that people don't need. Number two, are there customers at the low end of the market who would be happy to purchase a product with less performance if they could get it at a lower price? So this is it's particularly for a low end disruption. And then the third, which is the most important, is the innovation disruptive to all of the significant competitors in the industry. And that actually is um, much clearer, like the clearest indicative of whether or not this new product or company is disruptive or not. So just to take a simple example is, for example, Uber is a company that came in and put every single taxi company, all the significant competitors around the world at a major disadvantage when they were introduced. But right after Uber came Lyft and other companies. Now, those were, while they are disruptive to the taxi industry, they're no longer a disruptive company because they are every dollar they put into, like, let's say, advertisement or marketing awareness that ride sharing is more cost effective, more environmental than taxis, that dollar is going to bring benefit not just to them, but also to Uber, right? Likewise for Uber, after they have competitors, they are benefiting not just them, but also the other rideshare companies. But take this in contrast to when Uber was the only player when they first started. Uber had to take the entire load on their back of raising awareness to the customers. Is it safe? How do I know if the Uber driver is not gonna kidnap me, etc. Right? So they had to put all the customer awareness, had to invest so much into marketing, into promotions, into branding, to introduce the entire industry. So they did. So they were considered a disruptive company because of that. So that's an important thing. You might get a question in a quiz or even in a exam, midterm or otherwise final, that would say, are these companies disruptive or not? And we would have to give you like a list of companies, and you'd know whether or not they were disruptive. Okay. So finally here, I just want to do a quick positioning sketch. And I lost my pen. It's not with me. Let me see. Oh, forgot it. Okay, in the other room. This has been a journey. So this is the last slide, and I just wanted to go over a few items related to positioning that I have not considered. So I'm just going to try to sketch it with my hand here. And here we go. So there's two types of positioning. that we can give as examples. There is a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional. So a two-dimensional would give like something like a Cartesian. Sorry, that wasn't so good. Here, so this is, we can say, for example, this is price, and this is quality, let's say, okay? And so what normally would happen in these two-dimensional positioning boards is we put all the companies that are existing in the market, that are within your industry. So you are the industry of toothbrushes, right? So there are some really low quality, low price options. So you'll find them around here, right? And then there are some okay options here, middle price, middle quality. And then there are some high price and high quality options around, let's say, here. Okay. All right. Is that cool? So you want your company to be, in this positioning. You're like, okay, we don't want to be the most expensive. We don't want to be the cheapest. We are, from this perspective, it doesn't look exactly where we are. We are an environmentally conscious paste toothbrush company. So we're going to try to be environmentally conscious while maintaining that we are affordable. So we're going to be around here, perhaps, that's where we would like, or here, right? Keep in mind that there is a general tendency to keep, I'm just going to put here a line. This is the line, x equals y, the linear line where quality is a direct like a relation to price. Quality goes up, price goes up. But we want, imagine if we can push things this way, right? So this is the most desirable range, right? This is the most desirable range where we can get things for lower price and higher quality, right? So a lot of desirable range people try to beat that, right? While on the other hand, this is the not desirable range, right? So you don't want something that's expensive and really low quality, right? So that's something for you to understand. It's basically when you're making a two-dimensional, that there is this kind of positioning. Sometimes there are like asymptotes where you can't go there. It's impossible. Sometimes they're like you should never go there because it's only like scammers go to that zone in the positioning. So you need to decide on that well. The second perspective we can sometimes we need it is when we have a three-dimensional. I'm gonna remove my face. There you go. It's a three-dimensional positioning strategy where we have three factors that are not well, that they're equally important. So most typical, you find this, a common example I'd like to give is in the electronics manufacturing industry, where you have cost in one leg, and then the delay, or let's call it speed. It's a D actually. So the how fast the processor is of the chipset or of the processor, and um, delay and the power, right? So the power of this chipset or processor. Okay, so you have speed, power, and price, and you can understand the most expensive is going to be around here. So the most expensive is going to be around here. The kind of you can either go between the most powerful to the fastest, or in between the most powerful and fastest, and those are definitely going to be the most expensive. Now, when you go to the cheapest, by nature of this dimensional positioning system, you're going to be the slowest and the least powerful model. Um, and so you need to position yourself. You want to be affordable, um, you know, like up to here. You want to be affordable towards getting some power and some speed. You want to be affordable by getting more on the speed side, or more on the power side. That's all up to your positioning. But you need to understand what are the positioning metrics in the industry you are in. What are the most important factors to the customers? And then you need to do your research and come up to a decision. So most of the times, these decisions are not arbitrary, and these decisions require you to go back and do a loop to reiterate whether or not this is possible. So you say, okay, we're going to be, we're going to be right here. Let's say, example, we're going to be right here. We're going to be the highest quality and decent price, or we're going to be right here. Which all of this, by the way, again, this is also impossible, right? So these two asymptotic. So this is too stupid to be true, and this is too good to be true, right? But I want to be somewhere around here. So I go and decide I want to do this, and I look at, okay, this is going to be price range is this much, quality, I'm going to have to quantify that in metrics. So I need it's lasts for this long. The brushes, if we're still talking about toothbrushes, the brushes are made of this material, the handles made of this material, etc., etc. And then I pass it on to my engineers, from the marketing team to the engineers. Now the engineers are going to go and come back and say, well, we could do that, but it's gonna, we're gonna need a manufacturing facility of this expense, and so we're gonna have a larger start like overhead, and you go back to the marketing, and the marketing guys said, yeah, is it worth it to be here? Or what about if we move in just one little smidget to here, for example? Is that raise the price a bit or reduce the quality a little bit? Is that going to be that might make a huge difference on engineering perspective? Does it is it still acceptable on marketing perspective? So the conversation is not like top down. It's not like marketing people decide and engineers are like slaves who have to follow. Marketing people put that we want to be within this metric. We want to be among the top 25% quality, while maintaining that we are in the lower 75% of cost. And then the engineers are going to go look and say, okay, what are the requirements for us to do this? And come back. And there's some iterations that happen between engineers and market people until we get that. So we always start by the marketing people saying, okay, this is where we would like to be, and then engineers go back and say, is it possible? So you validate this by prototyping and market research, and then you go back and say, okay, if it's not possible, then what's the next possible thing, or should we completely pivot to a different competition? And that's basically everything I wanted to share with you in terms of deciding on your positioning. Okay. Now your project deliverable 1 is going to be due next week. That's D1. So D is for marketing. And so you're going to have to do a competitive mode chart, a SWOT analysis, some customer segmentation, and a market and product positioning for your own company. And if you're going to do that, you're going to need to do an IBIS report on your industry. You're going to need to do much of what I've explained in this lecture around project deliverable D1. So good luck with that. The full instructions are on Brightspace. Finally, just coming up, deadlines are stacking, and it's also midterm season. So I just wanted to let you know that this coming Wednesday, you have quiz 2. I had earlier posted that it's PDB0. I mistakenly mixed up. It's supposed to B0 was already last week. So PDB1 is this Wednesday. That's what I mentioned last lecture, right? So you started interviews. We talked about interviews last lecture, and we said you're going to start interviewing. And then next Monday, you're going to have your midterm. Midterm is going to be 1 hour and 15 minutes from 5:30 until 7. Sorry, it's going to be from 1, it's going to be 105 minutes. So 1 hour and a half plus 15 minutes from 5:30 until 7:15. And then you're going to take about 10 minutes or 15-minute break. And then we start the lecture around 7:30 for about 1 hour until 8:30. The midterm is gonna have 2 parts. So one part is gonna be about general knowledge, MCQ, true and false, connect, fill the blanks, etc. To the definitions, what's a value proposition, what's a business model, etc. That kind of thing. Very basic information. Basically a recap to what we've studied so far. And then the second part is going to be on the case study that you will be receiving. So I am yet to confirm. It should be, I believe it's Netflix. I have to double check with the TA that the case study is going to be Netflix. You will have to print it because we'll be using Respondus, and Respondus will lock in your entire screen, will not allow you to open another browser, and will have your camera and mic on recorded during the midterm. And so you can't have a PDF because you can't switch tabs while you're working, and you can't close the tab that you're taking the exam with. And so make sure that you print it. You have a full week. Make sure you have the case study will be confirmed by the TA. What's the case study he picked for you? Now, after that, we're going to have a 1 hour lecture about personas and branding, advertisement, digital advertisement, and so on. That's the second part of the marketing module. The following Wednesday, which is July 1st, happy Canada Day, we're going to have project deliverable B2 and then D1, which is what we discussed today. So the first marketing deliverable D1. The Monday that follows is going to be a project deliverable C. That's the next lecture that we're going to meet, and that is going to be the group presentation, your first group presentation. So looking forward to seeing you all then. You're going to be presenting live what you have reached so far in your business, and you'll get live grilling from me and the TAs to help you, steer you if you are going in the right direction, or if we need to put any breaks and say, you're gonna clash into some legal problems, or this is not feasible, and you can minimize or make it smaller or switch slightly, and so on. So we're gonna have those group presentation, full details on the project deliverable C, and the instructions and the rubrics are gonna be available on Brightspace. So that's it.